So it's a theology conference, but I'm going to give a kind of a cultural diagnostic of how society's view of Christianity has changed over the last 60 years and what to do about it.
Okay, and so you talk about the three worlds, the negative world, the neutral world, and the positive world.
Yes.
How did you start to develop that framework?
Well, back in 2014, I was living in Indianapolis before I moved to New York City, and a friend of mine had created a series of short films called For the Life of the World, after the book by the Orthodox theologian, is it Alexander Schmemann?
Alexander Schmemann,
Yeah,
one of my favorite books.
Yeah, so they drew from that. And, there was like one on work and there was one on love. It was sort of like various themes of life and how Christianity relates to life. And I went and saw it. It screened at a local university. And I came out, I'm thinking, man, that was really well done. Extremely professionally produced film. It was great. Students loved it. But I said, that's basically the film for 5 years ago. Ultimately, I said, this is great, but like the world is about to change. And we're going to enter into a completely new paradigm of culture. And so I went home and I got out my computer and I typed in all these bullet points about what I was seeing. And then I wrote it up in a newsletter, kind of my underground newsletter that I was publishing at the time. And it got a lot of viral pickup at the time when I wrote it. And then in February 22, First Things Magazine asked me to update it and do a version for their magazine. So I did it. There was an article called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. And it was a big hit for them. And then I essentially turned the article into a book, not just with, the Three Worlds article was more just the diagnostic of culture, which maybe we can talk about in a minute if you like. And then the book has a lot more about what we should do as well.
Yeah, so on that kind of the diagnostic of culture, you talk about how the evangelical world essentially responded to the negative world and the neutral world. There's the culture war movement, in the 80s, even in the 90s. Then there was the seeker-sensitive kind of mega churches, and then there was the city kind of cultural engagement, or like Mako Fujimura would call it culture care.
Right.
And I would say that, in my own experience, growing up as a Lutheran and then basically, I was sort of in a dying, a lovely but dying Lutheran Missouri Synod church. It was more conservative, but it was still pretty sleepy. And I remember being, 16 years old and saying, Mom, Dad, I really want to go to the mega church. We can't take it here anymore. There's no young people. So I remember actually loading up the family van and picking up all my, kind of non-religious friends in my local public school community. And we would go to the mega church, pretty much every weekend. And it was totally seeker sensitive. It was all, it was basically all black and dark, and there were like curtains hung everywhere. And like, that
rock concert ambiance.
Yeah, it was rock concert ambiance. And we still, my family still, they no longer go there, but, they're still close with the pastor. And, it was kind of like a TED Talk for, 40 minutes with a rock band. But to your point, I do remember as a high school student, being very, even in my high school, which was, South Central, rural Michigan public school, it was one of those things where I would say of the 100 kids in my graduating class, I would estimate that probably 5 to 10 at most were sort of, kind of publicly devout in their religious faith. Well over 90% of them, I would say, they weren't social conservative at all, but they were probably culturally, today you would say they were culturally conservative, right? But at the time, all you cared about in high school was sort of sports, drinking, girls, like it was kind of basic, like dirty movies, like, and so, anyways, but it's funny because at the time, even just inviting other of my friends to go to like this mega church, it was maybe like, yeah, Johnny is a little quirky. It was very different than, say, being in New York and inviting someone to maybe go to church. But like people, it's still like, oh, this is kind of Johnny's thing, but it's still totally fine and cool. And maybe I'll learn some life lessons while I'm there, and no big deal,
Right.
But then interestingly enough, well, actually, I'll pause there. I'm curious kind of how that relates. You said you grew up in
Southern Indiana. Yeah,
so what was your experience like growing up?
I say very similarly. Now, I was raised in a kind of rural Assemblies of God church. It was very much a culture war type church, very end times, apocalyptic, that sort of thing. But again, your description of high school would be very similar to what I did. Probably most likely, more of my high school classmates are like open religious today than they were in high school. Of course, in high school, again, you're not interested in that. You're interested in other things, and then when you have kids, maybe you want to take them to church.
That's still into their church communities.
That's still the case. Still the case there. And it's like the mega church movement. I mean, there's like a lot of it goes back to like Robert Schuller and different things. But like I really chart like the start of what I call the seeker sensitivity movement in kind of my book to Bill Hybels and Willow Creek Community Church in suburban Chicago. And then a little later, Rick Warren and Saddleback Church was another big one. But Bill Hybels, in the 1970s, went door to door in suburban Chicago asking people why they didn't go to church. So, this is a period of decline for Christianity. Again, I'll give people an overview of the three worlds in a minute in case they don't know it. But the key is people are detecting in this era that Christianity is in decline. In the mid-century era, it had been a really mainline dominated society, and they kind of went into decline. They started losing members, and they've never been able to pull out of the spiral. Basically, the dying Lutheran church kind of thing that you're talking about. And there was a lot of research in the 1970s, some of it funded by the Lilly Endowment, trying to figure out what's going on. How do we reverse this decline? And they never reversed it. And evangelicalism sort of filled the vacuum left by the retreat of the main lines. But a guy like Bill Hybels, he's like, went door to door in Chicago. He asked, do you go to church? If the answer is yes, great. We don't have any more questions. If the answer is no, it's like, well, why don't you go to church? And as he said, I got an earful. And he then designed a church that people would be willing to attend. Well, they don't like the stodgy hymns. They don't like having to dress up. The sermons aren't relevant. All these things, right? But just the idea that like, I'll just go knock on someone's door and ask them why they don't go to church. That very act is like a product of an era that no longer exists. I mean, if you knocked on someone's door and said, do you go to church? No. Well, why don't you go to church? They look at you like you're from Mars.
What are you doing on my front porch?
What are you doing here? Are you like a crazy person? What are you trying to sell me? And so there was a sense that people had this like latent idea that I probably should be going to church. Maybe they were raised in, maybe they went to Sunday school when they were a kid. And, similar to like a Billy Graham crusade, he could sort of presume people knew what he was talking about when he's talking about Christianity. It was saturated the culture. It was kind of like, I probably should be going to church. I don't do it. There probably is a God. There probably is a hell where bad people go. I don't want to be one of those people. I want to do some good deeds. And so I think, it was just a different era. That's less the case today.
And then there's actually, before we get into kind of the cultural engagement, cultural care kind of mode, can you give a brief overview of these three different worlds?
So basically my point was that for most of America, we didn't have a state church, but we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So again, if you go back to the 50s, half of all adults attended church. The public schools, not private schools, public schools had prayer and Bible reading. We're adding in God we trust to our money, under God to the pledge. In the 60s, that starts to become unraveled. The status of Christianity in America goes into decline. And I divide that period of decline from 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. So in the positive world, 64 to 94, Christianity's in decline, as a guy like Bill Hybels was sensing, but it was still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man made people want to hire you, made you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian morality was still the basic morality of society. Around 1994, we hit a tipping point, enter the neutral world, where Christianity's not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a pluralistic public square. And that lasts from 1994 to 2014. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, sort of official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not make Fortune 500 companies. They all want to hire this guy. All right? And Christian morality is expressly repudiated and, in fact, seen as the new leading threat to the new public moral order. And that's been a very dislocating experience, to say the least, to American Christians and especially evangelicals.
And in terms of the kind of the engagement strategies for each of them, that last one, that cultural engagement, and here I am kind of mapping my own life journey onto your narrative. But after I left Hillsdale, I went to a Reformed seminary in France, and then I came back, and I essentially did a year-long fellowship with a group that really focused on that cultural engagement approach. But this was in 2013, so on the eve of kind of the entrance into the negative world. And what was really interesting about that experience is, and maybe I had just been in my Hillsdale bubble prior to that, but in this program, it was interesting because the teachers of the program were all kind of more rooted in the kind of the Tim Keller approach, and he was someone who I had a significant degree of admiration for. But what happened is the young people that were being recruited into the program, and they were mostly between the age, I was in the younger end, so I was like 23, the oldest was maybe 30 years old. And I would say, like, I don't know, it felt like 60, 70% of them had kind of, I don't know, I guess taken the bait of, more progressive kind of, they were part of the city culture, they were much more assimilated into that. And I remember there's this strong tension between the boomers that were running the program and the fellows that were a part of it. And it just felt like things were kind of coming, I don't know, it was coming undone. So what do you think are the benefits of the, to some extent, this culture care approach was a corrective or an excessive overcorrective, perhaps, from the culture war model. Right. What worked with that cultural engagement strategy, and I don't know, where is it today? Is it still effective, or is it not working in New York City?
Yeah, I think of the cultural engagement strategy as something that emerged in the 90s, pioneered by people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. It's sort of the urban Christian movement. Yeah. That again, it comes back. One reason I picked 1994 as the transition date is that that was when Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York, and New York came back. And people are streaming into the cities, and it's sort of this negative world, and the neutral world, and so it's one where it's like these people see the old Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and I think they rightly see the flaws in that model and say that's not us. They also look at the suburban megachurch people and say, we're not suburban boomers, with kids. This is the urban, and they like this. Whereas guys like Falwell like to fight with people. Yeah, these guys love to fight with people, and it's like, it's actually like, I lived in New York City. I'm like, I loved living in New York City. I like New York City. I like living in cities. I like going to the opera. I like doing all this stuff. So they were very positive, really, towards the urban environment, towards the urban cultures. Like, I don't want to fight with these people. And so it was this idea, let's just sit down and have a conversation. And you can think of something else that was going on in the early 90s that got going was the emerging church movement. Okay. Familiar with that? Sort of, some people describe the emerging church movement as sort of, Christianity's engagement, evangelicalism's engagement with postmodernity. But it was a lot of deconstruction. It's like we're going to have a church and a pub. Yeah. And we're going to have a lot of conversations. And we're going to welcome everybody. And it definitely had a progressive lens on it. So a guy like Rob Bell, for example, was big into that. But again, Mark Driscoll was also originally considered part of the emerging church movement. So there is these things happening, percolating in these eras. And I think the idea of the emerging church, we want to have a conversation. That was a big theme of it. Is, and again, Keller, it's like that. Another group organization founded about that time in the early 90s was the Veritas Forum. Yeah. Which they host events on campuses. I think it started at Harvard. Harvard's, motto is Veritas, or truth. And so it's like, we're going to bring in, they'll have like a secular philosopher and maybe a Christian philosopher. Come have a dialogue. We're just going to have a dialogue. It's going to be friendly. We're going to engage with college students. Very dialogue oriented, And, a guy like Tim Keller, he did a Google talk. He got invited to Google to give a talk.
That's unbelievable. And so you would never imagine that today.
Yeah, you wouldn't even think about that. And so it was this sense in which, so long as you didn't overtly throw a pie in people's face about, sexuality or abortion or something like that, you could get a hearing. right? If you weren't just like causing a ruckus and like being a provocateur and all of that. And it was very successful, I think, for its era. But it was a sort of product of this time in which this what I call again, called it this neutral world.
Mm-hmm. And as we're now in this negative world, you chart some rough kind of guidelines, strategies for how we should adapt to it. On the kind of the personal side, one of the ones that you focus on is excellence.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can kind of unpack what you mean by excellence, why it's needed. Yeah.
Well, there was a famous book written about 30 years ago by a historian, Mark Knoll, called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. The idea being that there is no evangelical mind. And, it's evangelicalism was always sort of a middle class movement. Mm-hmm. It's very anti-intellectual. We used to say things like when I was a kid. What was the old statement we have in church? God said it, I believe it, that settles it. It's like, period. And of course, that's an admirable approach to have. That like if God says something, then I guess we just gotta believe it. We don't get the option to just wiggle out, right, of what God says. On the other hand, it's like we don't want to actually think about anything. Mm-hmm. It's sort of embedded in that. And so evangelicals really have not been able to supply any intellectual leadership to their own movement.
Sure.
And you look at political conservatism. So many people in political conservatism were Catholic or Jewish, and very few evangelicals. I mean, there are a handful of Protestants here and there, but where are the Protestant evangelicals? So if you look at when a Protestant wants to look at a critical diagnosis of a liberalism, where do they turn? They probably look at Patrick Deneen, who's a Catholic professor.
Sure.
If they want to understand secularism, secularization, they look to Charles Taylor, who's a Catholic philosopher. So they're looking to these Catholic thinkers. They don't necessarily have in people, internally. They don't have this cadre of intellectuals.
Sure.
And so, and again, there are some, but it's much weaker. And so I think this idea of just being more excellent is really important, intellectually, but in other ways. The fact that so many young men, I got interested in evangelical issues really because it was through men's issues, because I saw so many young men a decade ago turning to online influencers instead of to the church.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on there? And this was even before Jordan Peterson came on the scene. I'm like, what is happening? And what you realize is I just went to Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God tour. They went to a 2,500 seat theater in downtown Indianapolis, sold out.
You
packed.
Just went to this.
Yeah, a few weeks ago. And he's giving his exegesis of the book of Genesis.
Okay.
So people are looking to Jordan Peterson to tell them about the Bible.
Yeah.
They're not looking to the church. And Peterson, I think part of it is his expertise in psychology and other things. And I'm not the hugest Jordan Peterson fan on everything. I'm not trying to, but he obviously had a way of reaching people that we haven't had. And he has a very intellectual approach and way of doing things. So we need to have that expertise. And then just in general in life, the economist Tyler Cowen wrote a book a few years ago called Average is Over. It's like the middle class is getting eviscerated. You're either going to be excellent or you're going to be consigned to the bottom. That's reality of what's happening to our society today. And so we need to, elevate our game. It's hard to get married and stay married today. Look at our falling marriage rates. Apparently a quarter of 40-year-olds have never been married. We just had another all-time record low in fertility. The divorce rates come down. It's still 40%. So if you want to get married, stay married today, that's hard.
Yeah.
It requires more focus, effort, intentionality than ever before. And so that call to excellence is really, we got to have that.
So you had a piece, I think it was called Leveling Up. Yeah. Was that the name of your blog post? Kind of offering, I don't know, it's really kind of advice on how to be excellent, how to kind of rise to a certain level of maturity so that people take you seriously as a person. If you're thinking of the college students that are involved with ISI, I don't know, what are a few pieces of advice you might have for them on how to level up as they transition, especially from college to their workplace?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes in it. First off, the ISI students that I've met are so far ahead of the game. When I was young, I was in college, and it's like I was in high school. It's like, oh, I better go to college, so I better apply to some schools. And so I applied, and I got into one, and I went to State U, and then I was there, and I really wasn't too much. You can't get away with that today, right? If you want to get into a decent school, it's like an 18-year project. Some people, it starts before they're born. Their parents are like, and a lot of these Gen Z people, Gen Z gets a lot of flack. Actually, the best of Gen Z is the best we've ever had. And these young people are excellent, and so they're already ahead of the game. But I'd say there's a couple things I'd say, and this is as you go up there, and again, some of this is like I'm preaching to myself because these are the things that I did. It's like, as you get older, you want to have a certain gravitas about what you're doing. You want to be more serious. And so I was always kind of a jokester, always kind of a little more Gen X, kind of cynical, sarcastic humor. And, I was always kind of a little bit of a rebel pose. And things like that. And, it's great a little bit when you're young, but when you get older, you really, that doesn't play. People expect you to be, operating differently. If you're in your 50s, which I am, you can't act like you did when you were in your 20s. And like one of the trends that we see today is kidulting. You hear about kidulting. It's like, a huge share of Lego's revenue now is coming from adults who buy Lego sets. And like all the adults who want to go to Disneyland, it's like everything is like kid stuff that like adults are embracing. Yeah. The fact that everybody's still into Star Wars, when they're adults and things like that.
I've even heard of Lego-themed weddings, Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's bad, but you got to think about like, as you get older, you want to be taken seriously. It's like, I want to be given a promotion into an executive or leadership position, then you have to really, act like you belong, in that position. People have to see you as like leaning into the part. It's like I say, be the leader. Who is the leader that we want to see in America, right? Who do we want to be our president? Who do we want to be our governor? Like, it's probably not somebody sitting there making cynical jokes on Twitter all day, like I would be prone to do. And so it's like, you gotta be more serious. Another thing is just to be aware of the context of people investing reputational capital in you. So when first job I had out of college was in consulting, and I was at Accenture, which is a great consulting company. And, we would, bid on projects from companies, and they would hire us. And we did great work, and we worked really hard. And, if I think back about it, I realized, like, wait a minute. Somebody at this company went to bat to hire us, especially if it's a big, important project. If this thing fails, somebody might lose their job at the company. If this thing doesn't deliver business results, if there's no ROI on this thing, somebody's going to start asking questions. Yeah. And it's to realize that, like, wow, people are really putting, like, taking on personal risk to have me or have Accenture do that. And I didn't really get it in my gut. I could have told you that, but, like, it didn't really hit me in the gut until one day I'd kind of switched into doing urban work, and I got my first major speaking invitation. I was invited to keynote the annual meeting of this organization in Indianapolis. And I realized something, the head of that organization took a big chance to hire this unproven guy to deliver this address. I had better nail that talk. I mean, I prepared, I wrote it out, I rehearsed. I have to do a great job. Yeah. And, again, people take a chance, so I have a podcast. I got listeners, okay, but I'm not, I'm not the Ben Shapiro show. I'm not Joe Rogan. I don't have leadership. I don't have listenership. I'm not Fox News. So, I do a lot of work on men's issues. Senator Marco Rubio's office put out, a report on kind of men's. This is great. I wrote something up on it, and I contacted his office. Can I get, the senator to come on my podcast and talk about it? And they said yes. So, Marco Rubio came on my podcast. Senator Rubio. I'm like, wow, this is great. Okay, great. His staff probably put their jobs on the line. You should do this guy's podcast. And it's like, okay, if I then go out the next day and say or do something crazy, it reflects badly on them.
Yeah.
And so I do think we can't necessarily allow reputational considerations to control. Sometimes you have to be willing to be hated.
Sure.
Sometimes there's a matter of principle. But I think you got to recognize that when people pick you for something, they are taking a personal risk in doing that. And what you want to communicate to people is that you are a good person to bet chips on. Do I want to bet my chips on Johnny Burtka to be the next president of ISI? Because if you don't do a good job, the organization could get off track. It could be a crisis for the org. Happens a lot of times.
Sure.
So it's like, yeah, we want to be the person who is seen as this is the person, that you want other people to feel confident, investing in you. And so one of the things that I do is I always take things far more seriously than I used to now. Because again, for a lot of things when I speak at events or speak at conferences, speak at a conference here, it's personal. People didn't just hire the firm that I work for. They hired me.
Yeah.
And I have to deliver for them. And so delivering above expectations on that stuff, very, very important there. Because a lot of times you don't realize that the things that I'm doing telegraph that I'm a bad risk, that I'm not somebody that I'm a loose cannon. I'm a loose cannon. You really want to take a chance on a loose cannon. And I think, the social media incentive structure is to be a provocateur and a loose cannon, and you can go that route. And everybody needs to stick out in the market. You got to have a unique selling proposition. But you also need to think, man, if you're acting, if you're a performer on stage, I'll just act like Donald Trump acts. Well, you're not Donald Trump. Yeah. Okay. And it's going to be consequences. So that's one thing I'd be aware of. And again, when you're young, you don't have to have it all figured out. But as you get older, the expectation levels are going to go up. People are expecting you to start acting like a more senior leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so let's say you're graduating from a top school, you're conservative, you're ambitious. Do you, in the negative world, kind of take the route that you took, going to an Accenture, going to kind of one of these big, established kind of mainstream companies, and kind of cut your teeth for a few years and then kind of pivot into this alternate conservative, either nonprofit or financial or media ecosystem? Or would you say opt out of that and go straight into the counterculture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had a great experience at Accenture. Accenture is a great firm. It's definitely, it's quote unquote woke capital.
Sure.
It's a woke capital company.
Yeah.
It really is. If you can go there today, it's had a great success. There are other firms. One thing I would say is, it's like this in an organization. The most narrow-minded people are always in middle management. They're the ones that always want to say no. The CEOs, if you can get to them, are often the most open-minded people in the organization. They're interested in new ideas. And something similar happens with employers, and with schools. So if you think about Harvard Law School, for example, take Harvard's Law School, let's take Goldman Sachs, let's take McKinsey. These companies know that it is in their best interest to have conservatives working there, right? For one thing, you want conservative elites to have to aspire to send their kids to Harvard.
Sure.
Because then they're going to defend Harvard.
Yeah.
They're going to be invested in the system, right? That's why a guy like Ken Griffin, a Republican, gave Harvard $300 million unrestricted, right? And that's what people do. And now if Harvard Law School, let's take Harvard Law School, if they say we're going to start discriminating against conservatives, pretty soon conservatives are going to start holding it against Harvard Law School when it comes to Supreme Court. There's no more Supreme Court appointments from Harvard Law School.
Yeah.
We're not going to have
a pipeline. That'd be a huge blow.
It would be a huge blow to Harvard. And so the most elite companies understand, we actually want conservatives, or at least Republicans, at Goldman Sachs, because when there's a Republican president, we want somebody that they could name Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah.
It's elite. Again, elite institutions understand that you don't just want to be all one team.
Yeah.
I think when you get down in the, the pecking order, it's not, they don't have a sophisticated view of the world, let's just say.
Okay.
So if you truly go into an elite company, there's going to be an understanding. We got to actually have some Republicans here.
Yeah. So this is totally just one last question, which is a big one, kind of getting back to where we started with Protestantism. How fundamental is Protestantism to America, to its political principles, to its the triumph of America on the world stage, going from colony to nation state to perhaps empire? And do you believe that the future of America, the future of Christianity America, the future of the success of the American project will hinge particularly on a revival of Protestantism as opposed to Catholic or other forms of Christianity?
Yeah. America was a Protestant country, and culturally it's still basically a Protestant country. I think it's still plurality Protestant, if not majority Protestant. I just tweeted this line from Bill Crystal, or Irving Crystal, who said something like, the Constitution had many fathers, but only one mother, which was Presbyterianism and Puritanism. And, the Constitution, the design of the Constitution is a little bit modeled on how Presbyterian churches govern themselves.
Okay.
The states are like the presbyteries a little bit, the Congress is like the General Assembly, and, the Constitution is like the Westminster Confession of Faith. And, I'm not an expert on that, but there was apparently it was an inspiration there. And the country was essentially run entirely by Protestants through the 1950s. And so this is really a product of, also kind of the Weberian, Protestant work ethic. And if you look at a lot of the countries that were Protestant, where were the most advanced industrial countries? The UK, the United States, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, these Protestant countries. It wasn't Italy, right? Where my family. I'm from Catholic peasant stock on both sides of my family, and so I think there was a sense that this basically was a Protestant country, and its founding was Protestant, and its culture wasn't as Protestant. And, even the Catholic culture of America has become very heavily Protestantized. The Catholic culture of America is not the Catholic culture of Latin America. It's not the Catholic culture of Italy. It's a very different place. Now, we're not going back to sort of the Protestant-dominated society. For one thing, we're just demographically not a Protestant country anymore. But nor do I believe that, Catholicism can replace it. There was a book by Joseph Bottom, An Anxious Age, and he was a Catholic writer. And he basically said he thought the crisis of America was the crisis of sort of, the collapse of Protestantism. And there was this, this Catholic moment when people thought Catholicism might rise up and provide a replacement scaffolding for it, but it didn't happen, and it won't happen, right? Because we're not a Catholic country.
Yeah.
So I think part of what it means to be in a negative world is that the old Protestant culture has collapsed. Again, there's a new book by a French writer named Emmanuel Todd. It's been getting a lot of press, called The Defeat of the West. And he was famous because he was the first person to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
And maybe a lucky guess, but he was right. But his point was he talked about Protestantism as sort of the motor of industrialization in the West. And he's like, what's happened now? He actually says 2015 was his date in America. Okay. We've reached what he called the Protestant zero state. Which is to say there's no more substrate left. He talked about, there used to be called active Protestantism. People believed in it. It was like the religion really animated the culture. Then we entered this zombie Protestant state, which was most of the, probably the 20th century prior to 1965 was zombie Protestantism, which is to say people don't really believe in it anymore, but the values and the culture, the mores of society are still that of the religion. Again, the old Protestant work ethic, the drive for literacy and education and things of that. And then, but when you get to the zero state, right, you've used up all the fumes. Yeah. Now there's no more. And you kind of left with kind of nihilism and some other things. And so I think he's right that we're sort of in a Protestant zero state culturally. I mean, there's probably some Protestant residuals in America. And I'm not sure that it's going to be regenerated. Maybe it will. I don't know how it's going to play out. But I think that's one of the things that we have to grapple with. There's no more center in America. There used to be a cultural center around sort of Protestantism. There was an elite, the WASP elite, the establishment as they call it. There was sort of, they were actually running the country. They were thinking about the country. They had a sort of institutional memory and consciousness of what they were doing. Now we just have individuals. Man, maybe Trump gets elected. Maybe Biden gets elected. But there's no, it's one of the points Todd made, there's no national project. Yeah. There's no national set of values anymore. It's a collection of individuals doing things. And so I think it's going to be challenging. I'm not predicting the decline. I'm not shorting America by any means. I think there's a lot of great opportunities for America. I think we always have this idea, I think in conservatism, that, if the liberals win, it's over for society. If Christianity goes away, society will collapse, I'm not predicting that. It just might be a not great society or a society that we don't like. Maybe it keeps going for a really long time. But I'm not predicting a renewal of Protestantism in America in the near term for sure.
Okay. Well, on that note, we'll end. Thanks for joining, Aaron.
Thank you.